Good afternoon. I'm Chris Scherer, Member Communications Director of the Society of Broadcast Engineers and the co-host of this month's episode of the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. This is a monthly SBE meeting usually held on the third Monday of the month. The SBE is the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals with nearly 5,000 members, mostly in the U.S., but also around the world. I'll turn it over to SBE Treasurer and Social Networking Committee Chair Kevin Trueblood in a moment, but first, here's your SBE member update for March 20, 2023. The 2023 NAB show is less than 1 month away, and the SBE will of course be there exhibiting and holding several meetings and events. The SBE membership meeting will be on Monday, April 17th, followed by the member reception. The Board of Directors will meet Sunday morning, and several committees and groups will meet on-site as well. For the full rundown of everything the SBE is doing at the convention, go to sbe.org/2023NAB. The SBE is also bringing the SBE Ennis Workshop back to an in-depth educational event. Spanning 2 days, April 14th and 15th, there are 2 learning tracks being offered. Next Gen Broadcast, which is all about ATSC 3.0, and RF 101 Bootcamp. You must register in advance for either track, and this registration is separate from any NAB show registration. Both tracks are 2 full days of great information, and you can get all the details at sbe.org/2023NAB-Ennis. Make your plan now to arrive a couple days early and attend the SBE Ennis Workshop. There are 2 webinars by SBE on the calendar coming up. On March 23rd, Mike Pappas returns for Last Mile Solutions for Cloud-Based Broadcasting Part 2. This webinar builds on the first session with a deeper dive into advanced system configuration, including 5G LTE, Starlink, and fiber to fully redundant systems to feed transmitter sites. On May 11, the SBE RF Safety Course returns for the 2023 update. Stephen Lockwood provides an overview of RF radiation issues and practices for broadcasters. Also, you can always access the entire library of webinars by SBE presentations on demand. For information on these and all the webinars by SBE, go to sbe.org/webinars. The SBE will offer certification exam opportunities at the 2023 NAB show. The deadline to register for these sessions has already passed, unfortunately. The next chapter window at local chapters, that is in June. The application date for those exams is April 21. If you don't want to wait, or if a local chapter exam is not convenient for you or just not possible because of in-person restrictions, private proctoring is available. More information on SBE certification is online at sbe.org/certification. The annual SBE membership drive began March 1st. The theme this year is The SBE and You, the Perfect Fit. Recruit a new SBE member from March 1st to May 31st, and you not only help grow the society, you can earn a discount on your 2024 dues, and you'll be entered into the prize drawing. Prizes range from shirts and hats to gift cards to broadcast equipment. The grand prize is a paid trip to the SBE National Meeting in September in Columbus, Ohio. Get all the details at sbe.org/drive. And that is your SBE member update for March 20, 2023. Now I turn it over to the host of today's SBE WEBxtra, SBE Treasurer and Social Networking Committee Chair, Kevin Trueblood.
Well, thank you so much. It is great to be here, and we are once again talking in the industry about yet another cybersecurity attack, and it's a high-profile event that affected a lot of broadcasters in the industry. And every time that these kinds of things happen, well, it always resurfaces a lot of questions and concerns and best practices and ways that you can avoid becoming the next target of a cybersecurity attack or a ransomware attack. So that's what we're talking about today, is best practices and what actually is happening and the best ways to prevent that. And our guest today is a pretty good person to talk about just that. Wayne Pesina is with Texas A&M University. He's over at I believe it's TMU. Is that the correct one?
KAMU.
KAMU.
Station.
Yeah, you're west of the Mississippi, but...
That's right. Not to confuse with those guys up in D.C.
But I can't think of a better person who could introduce all of this, because Wayne has done a number of presentations at the NAB as well as webinars with the SBE and he's basically our go-to person when it comes to issues like this. So I want to call you like our senior networking IT correspondent or something like that if we were on a news network. Does that title work for you?
Boy, that title works.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your expertise.
Thanks, Kevin. Good to be here, and it's also good to talk about an important topic for everyone out there.
Indeed. So let's get right into it. And what I'm kind of thinking of here is let's kind of start at the beginning of what people think about when they think of cyber attacks and IT security, because as we're finding out with a lot of FCC filings and a lot of the things that they're proposing is a lot of stations don't have basic security or maybe don't do best practices. So I want to kind of start with what are some of the, risks that stations face on a day-to-day basis, whether they're practicing great IT security or not.
Well, from a broadcast standpoint, certainly, we all have our business systems that are vulnerable to some type of attack. But more importantly, if you look at our broadcast infrastructure, particularly as you have migrated or are migrated to the IP environment, now that puts our broadcast content at risk for disruption in in a number of different ways. That disruption might be just an outright outage, but that disruption also might be maybe some alternate content that we really do not want to be broadcasting. So I think there can be a number of factors at risk, and with that comes maybe your reputation. There also comes some financial implications and maybe even some liabilities that occur when these cyber incidents do occur.
Yeah, this goes beyond just somebody getting into your system. Like you said, this can affect somebody can put something on your airwaves, somebody could access your files, somebody could lock up your automation. I mean, the damage can be quite extensive to a broadcast station in these kinds of events.
Of course, and certainly we all read in the trade publications about these major incidents that have occurred, whether it's recently or in the past. What you don't necessarily read about in the trade publications is the maybe the small broadcast stations that are impacted well and have experienced incidents. Ransomware attacking the sole let's say, automation server in a small radio station can be absolutely devastating to that station.
Yeah, that's true. So they haven't come out in the recent ones that we've seen, the high profile events like with Skyview Networks and now most recently with Dish Network. They haven't really come out. They've given very few details about what actually happened, but it's a pretty good guess when things like that happen. And it's so debilitating to an organization, it's probably a ransomware attack. And let's kind of start at the beginning with a ransomware attack. What is a ransomware attack, and how does that impact? Like, how can it just bring an operation to its knees the way that this has?
Well, certainly ransomware can take on many different variants, so to speak. But in general, they all sort of follow a very similar pattern in that there is malware, which is basically injected into the IT infrastructure. And that can come or arrive in many different ways. Um, a simple one might be a clicking on a URL that is not really what you think it is. Maybe there's something embedded in a macro of an attachment that you receive. Um, Whatever the method, that basically malware effectively then encrypts your storage. And particularly on, let's say, again, whether that's your desktop administrative computer or maybe that is, some of your broadcast infrastructure like a content server. Um, but basically, that storage device becomes encrypted. And often you see then a message display that your files have been encrypted. And of course, that can all be fixed with, sending the right number of bitcoins, to the appropriate address. And then, of course, you hope that that encryption can actually be turned around and your files returned.
And this actually will completely lock you out of a system. And as I understand, like, so as you're saying, somebody can click a link in an email on a desktop and then boom, it's off to the races. And it doesn't just impact that workstation that somebody clicked a suspicious email on. This is, it can basically lock up every workstation and every server in a known destination. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The reality is of our infrastructures today, rarely do you have a standalone, let's say, device, whether again it's that desktop administrative computer or some piece of infrastructure in your broadcast chain. Everything is networked together. So the encryption process generally is going to target a local drive first. Once that is done, so to speak, it then looks for other drives. Maybe that is a network server that has been mounted. Maybe that is the USB backup drive that you have plugged into that device, or even your enterprise wide backup system. So it tries to search or move laterally throughout the network infrastructure to basically encrypt other storage systems as well.
And it does like all your Dropbox, all your cloud storage. Like these things can get really nasty. I mean, they can really get
Yes.
into everything.
Yes, and that is one of the challenges uh, associated, and of course, the danger as well is how do you prevent that type of movement?
Yeah, and we're going to kind of address that here in just a little bit.
Mhm.
But I guess that's the big question. I know a lot of I see the people who kind of critique this. We all can Monday morning quarterback these kinds of events. But I don't think people realize, people who haven't been through these kinds of attacks don't really realize how debilitating it can be, because it can bring, I mean, think about how much we rely on technology for everything, and imagine something like this getting into every little thing that runs your organization. Every file,
Right.
everything you could possibly need is gone unless you come up with this ransom. So it can really bring an entire facility to a stop.
Absolutely. Whether it's a large facility or even a small one, it is totally debilitating. And if you look at some of the major ransomware incidents that have occurred, and how did they resume operation? Well, it's like, okay, we went back to typewriters and paper and pencils and all of the ways we used to do things before technology came along.
Back in the Stone Ages. So everybody is like,
Stone Ages,
"Hey, guess what?
exactly.
We're finally, the victorious. The ones that are using the typewriters are suddenly happy with their decisions."
That's right.
You can't encrypt a typewriter unless somebody comes by and smashes the key on you, and even then you can
There you
start over.
go.
So I guess that's the big question. So, okay, this has happened to a facility. This has happened to a broadcast facility, and this has happened at facilities besides Skyview. There's been some very notorious within the industry attacks that have happened in the public media system where you and I work. KQED in San Francisco was very, they were very vocal about what happened to them and how,
Hmm.
and the mistakes that they made and the ways that they could fix that going forward, which was great. But this has also happened to, I know, streaming providers, to other major commercial radio stations, that all of these kinds of things have happened. And in every case, it seems to take a while for them to recover. So I guess the question I'm going for here is how, okay, so it's taken over your entire facility. How do you recover from that besides going to typewriters?
Well, from a practical standpoint, the only real way to recover from ransomware is to restore, which means or implies that you have working backups of all of the critical infrastructure. And that in itself sounds simple, but the restoration process can be very complex and very time consuming, assuming you have valid backups that exist and your backup system has not been corrupted. So there's, a lot of factors that come into play. But from a practical standpoint, the restoration of through backups are really the only practical way to recover from ransomware. And part of the time delay that you mentioned often is if you think about you do backups, maybe you do incremental backups to save storage spaces. When you have to restore, then you have to do that restoration sort of in that step by step process. And it simply can simply take time in which to do that.
And just for clarification's sake, when you talk about backups, we're not talking about just some incremental file backup that you have, which can be helpful. But in this case, we're talking ideally drive images and things like that, because yeah, you can wipe, do format C and reinstall Windows, but you're obviously losing. If it's an automation computer, you have to reinstall everything and start over from zero. But ideally, you have snapshots or drive images that you'd be able to just go back to a starting point a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yes, that's right. The drive images I think are very important, and then you also have your data, and that really is probably or should be and generally kept separately. So you can go back to let's say day one and restore that operating system, the applications, and so forth, and then you have the challenge of dealing with the data. Well, the best way to restore the data is have full backups, but that also has some storage implications required. And if you do have the incrementals, then you have to do that restoration process in the proper order. And that assumes that all of your data backups are valid and restorable. One of the one of the kind of I'll call it cyber hygiene practices that you should do is test your backups. Can you really restore? Just because you're recording a backup, let's say every night at midnight, does not necessarily mean you can actually restore that information or that data.
I think to put this into like broadcast terms, I tell people all the time that to test your backup transmitters along those lines, because
Exactly.
your backup transmitter is only as good as when it's needed. So, at least when you do your regular inspections to turn it on, make sure that it generates RF so that the day that your main fails, it's ready to come up. You can fix it and address it and get it going. So
hmm
that's an excellent point. So when we talk about backups, I guess what are best practices? I like that term hygiene, backup hygiene or security hygiene.
Yeah, cyber hygiene
Cyber
is
hygiene. Yeah, I like that. So what are the best practices in this case for making sure you're taking backups and that you're able to restore them?
well, I think there's several things that I recommend. One is for the backup system itself to be I'm going to use the term intelligent backup system. And what I mean by that is often backup systems are just certainly another drive volume that are mounted and they're online all the time. Well, if that when that ransomware happens, that's most likely that volume is going to get corrupted and encrypted. So, but with an intelligent backup system, basically that system or that drive is mounted when it's time to do a backup. In other words, at let's say 2 a.m., uh, the backup is made and then that backup system goes offline. There's no longer mounted. Another good approach is to use the 3-2-1 rule for backups, which says you have three copies of all of the critical data. Uh, Two of those are on different type of media, and one of those is offline.
That's actually, and when you say offline, that can be like an external hard drive that you plug in, back up your files, and then disconnect and leaving your desk or something like that.
That's right. That can be as simple, to take it on a kind of a personal level to back up, you know, small stuff. That could be a USB thumb drive that is stuck in your pocket or stuck in your desk. An example often that I use in presentations when I talk about the 3-2-1 rule, I talk about the presentation, my PowerPoint file that I'm given. And I said, I follow that. I have a copy of it on the computer that's in front of me. I have a copy of it in my cloud storage. And then I pull my USB thumb drive out of my pocket, and there's my offline version.
It's funny you say that because I love right next to all this stuff here is a big rack of computers and various things because I do have a home lab and I do enjoy, tinkering with this stuff. And one of my projects actually is with a Raspberry Pi is for I'm going to put it at a transmitter site and it will power up basically once a week, connect here to over the VPN, copy files, and then shut itself back down again.
Okay, you have just constructed your own intelligent backup
See, I knew I was onto
solution.
something with that, but
There you
that's
go.
the big concern because I know in these kinds of events, anything that's basically on your network can be compromised, and that's something to keep in mind with any of your backups. That backups are great, backups are wonderful to have across your facility, as many as you can have. But if they're on and they are active and can be found on your network, then they can be compromised just the same when something actually when somebody gets a ransomware attack and they're not going to be any good anymore.
Right. And another related to that, another good practice is to segment your network. I think the traditional approach is that you have what is often referred to as a flat network. In other words, all the devices are on the same network. Segmentation, however, breaks up that network into layers or segments, which basically can limit that lateral movement that ransomware has. Now, yes, that creates some additional, support challenges or work, not really challenges, just some additional effort. But that network segmentation can be extremely important in a way to limit that lateral movement. It also has sort of a secondary advantage in terms of often will improve overall network performance by breaking things down into these smaller segments and limiting a lot of the broadcast traffic that are on networks that really doesn't need to go everywhere. I know our focus here is on cybersecurity, but there can be some advantages for it, and particularly since we deal with real time media as our broadcast content, then that performance improvements can be beneficial as well with that segmented or layered network.
And you're talking about like VLAN is probably the most common way to do that, where you can break things up to different subnets. And so you can contain like your office traffic on one and your studio traffic on another and your traffic network on another. So, like you said, it would be less likely if, say, the traffic manager got something on her computer that it would be less likely to impact other machines, right?
Exactly. And as far as, utilizing the VLAN, utilizing VLAN is just the what I think of as the practical approach to constructing or building a segmented network. Several ways to do it. You could do separate physical networks back in the early days. I know when there was maybe a lack of trust with this IP networking stuff to actually carry our content, we would build separate networks. In our facility, we had the blue network and the red network and the green network. Uh, that effectively was a segmented network. Today, however, utilizing a common physical infrastructure, uh, but break that up or segment that utilizing VLANs would be a practical way. And then when host devices on one, let's say, network or VLAN need to talk to another, then you do have to provide routing between those two networks, but you do that routing in a controlled manner. And through simple as using an access control list can control what devices can talk to what other devices, even down to maybe the protocols that those two devices can utilize to talk.
All right, so we've hit a lot of, particularly on ransomware, but let's talk a lot of the practical ways that stations can mitigate their risks, because they exist every day. If you have a network that is up and running and particularly is facing the internet, it is at risk. And even if it's not connected to the internet, there are some risks potentially. If it has, if you bring in a USB drive and you introduce something foreign to your network, that could be a problem too. But what are the best ways to help mitigate the risks? And if you want to cite your the slides that you provided for the class, just say the word.
Well, I do. Often, probably my summary of doing these things slides has once began. There was about 4 or 5 things that you ought to do, and of course now that slide is expanded with a number of specific things to do. Uh, but kind of again re-emphasize, segment your network, utilize some of the security features that you may already have, particularly with managed network switches. Utilize the port security features that are likely there. One that you hear a lot about, and it's kind of like, you know, oh no, not that again, but change those default login credentials. It is still amazing the number of devices that are out there with default login credentials. Other things, particularly on a Windows-based host, is to change or to separate the administrative and the user accounts, which by default are all the same. Change that so that a user uh, cannot actually execute and install things. Uh,
Wayne, I think I found your big master slide here that I can actually
okay.
bring up, and actually makes it probably is the point that you'll want to, like, people want to pause and take notes on this.
Yes, this is probably, again, maybe the very first bullet point is probably one that is most important, is kind of recognize there's no one single thing that you do to implement cybersecurity. Simply having a firewall, that's great, but that's not enough anymore, at least. So there's a multiple things that you should do, and implement multiple protections with the principle of defense in depth. In other words, you have multiple protection mechanisms with the idea if one of those mechanisms is breached, there's another one there as a barrier.
A lot of good ideas in here, and I think a lot of things that maybe people don't think as much about as they should. They kind of just coast along and think, oh, this is fine. It's worked for 10 years, 20 years. What's the problem? And
Yeah,
I always kind of mention like these, yeah, that works until it doesn't.
that's right. And I'd mentioned, you cannot rely on a firewall as your sole protection. Certainly, a firewall is a very important cybersecurity device to have. But if that firewall has been, let's say, was installed 3 years ago, 4 years, and you haven't touched it, I might question how effective it really is, because there is, once again, back to the cyber hygiene practices, things need to be updated and patched, because remember, the threats are evolving, they're continually evolving. In fact, one of the bullet points uh, suggests that you utilize the CISA known exploitable vulnerability catalog to kind of put into perspective how many active threats are out there today. Certainly haven't looked at that today, but I'd be willing to bet there's pushing 900 active individual potential threats that we're dealing with at this point in time.
Well, you raise a good point, because I think a lot of people think about uh, somebody, trying to get in through their firewall and accessing their system that way, which is entirely doable. But the reality these days is criminals are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And they've kind of figured out their way to get around that. And to that end, a lot of how attacks happen, and particularly ransomware and things like that, is they kind of do social engineering, which is where they send you a suspicious email, they send you something that looks legit and gets in through your network. So basically, they're figuring out the ways to get around the barriers that you've put up. So even $100 or a $50 router from Best Buy is a great practice over anything at all, for that matter, and
Right.
will probably protect you from the vast majority of threats out there. But it's not going to stop something like this, and even the most expensive firewall in the world isn't going to protect something like that.
Yeah. I think one of the risk or precautions is don't overlook the social engineering. Social engineering is very effective. That's why you see it used so much. There has been, improvements in technology and best practices that we've talked about, and they've been implemented. And as a result, it is more difficult to get into an infrastructure. But you also have to kind of also maybe consider who is the threat actor that I'm faced with here. Certainly, threat actors can range the gamut from nation states to uh, the hacktivists to it's a wide range. Uh, but a lot, particularly the motivation for someone implementing ransomware, well, as the name suggests, they want to impose a ransom on you. So they're out to make a dollar, actually, a lot of dollars.
Yeah, they wouldn't be doing it if they weren't getting paid out of this.
Yeah, so often, if there's any barrier whatsoever, they'll move on real quickly. They're looking for the low hanging fruit. And if there's any barrier, they're going to move on because time is money, so to speak, to them. Now, on the other hand, if your threat actor maybe is a hacktivist that has a grudge to grind with you, your broadcast station, and that could be a variety of reasons. Maybe it has to do with, something you broadcast that they didn't like. That's a whole maybe a little bit different environment, because a hacktivist tends to be persistent, where once again, someone just, the general hacker or the cyber gangs, as they're referred to, they're just out to, um, make a quick buck. And one of the other misconceptions, I think, if you read any of the literature, you see a portrayal of a hacker. It's always a guy, it seems like, wearing a black hoodie, sitting in a dark room in front of a green screen terminal. Well, that probably makes a pretty good illustration for a presentation or a publication, but that's not the real world that
You mean the
exists.
Matrix isn't real? They don't have those
Eh,
little green lines that are constantly going on the screen?
uh, Not today. Maybe at one time. Yes, you might have someone sitting in their basement just saying, what can I get into today? But the reality is, they are software applications being executed in a data center environment that are basically scanning the public internet, looking for potential host devices. And that's the reality of what you're facing.
These are all some great tips and some great food for thought. And I keep coming back to I've got people that I've dealt with over the years that are mad because their machines are locked down from an administrator access, and that's a general policy
Right.
for all of our users. Which I think that's something we can talk about here in just a second. But I get to kind of defer to the policy because they're begging me, oh, I need to have admin access because they want to do all these fun things with their computer. And it's like, you're the reason why that policy exists because, yeah, you've got some technical aptitude and you may be fine. But if I gave that to you and to everybody else, well, now we've got uh, a, a, a real tough situation on our hand where everybody can do anything they want with their machine. And well, now what?
Now what?
So
That's
somebody
right.
that basically somebody who's got enough knowledge to be dangerous is the phrase I'm looking for. So I guess if we were going to talk about setting policies, that's probably the far and away the best way you can do it because you can always just point back to this is the policy and it's set by management. So I guess how can people have those conversations? How can they get that started if they don't already have something like that set in motion?
One of the things to keep in mind that we often are faced with the cyber policies or rules of our organization that you often feel like someone just sits around and dreams up rules. Well, if you look at really some of the key cybersecurity principles, they are based foundationally on some principles, such as I mentioned, defense in depth, having those multiple protections, the principle of least privilege. In other words, you minimize the access or rights that an individual user or an application has to the resources. Uh, and with that, you also, though, have to balance uh, the security uh, and the risk. And as a result, often the advice is to use a risk-based approach and not apply necessarily the same rules to every situation, particularly if there's different risk involved with that. But keep the balance in check. And of course, you and I both are in a university environment operating broadcast stations. We often come into, I'll say, conflict with, in our case, our university uh, IP staff.
Yep.
I won't use the term I was thinking about. Um, you know, it's and we've all seen the Dilbert jokes
Yep.
that portray things pretty well. And I think that's why sometimes we come into the conflict. Often the same rules are applied to every, let's say, every host device. And they are different. They're different environments. And I think it's important if you're the one setting that policy is to keep that in mind. So even the small broadcast station likely will not have the same cyber policy, maybe for a, let's say, a desktop computer at the receptionist desk as they would, let's say, their transmitter control system, their content distribution network, their automation server, because the risk is different.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because there's a that's kind of the forever struggle between engineers and the IT department, and particularly in a university setting, because I can say wholeheartely that they sometimes make it difficult to get things done, but the reality is they are looking out. They're number one, following their best practices and the policies that they have set. In our case, we have to comply with state laws and state audits, which are a big deal, and they apply to us just as much as anybody else on campus. We're not a specialty, and if you're a publicly held organization, you've got Sarbanes-Oxley that you have to comply with. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you do have to comply with, and that's their job, is to make sure that they're keeping you safe. But one of the takeaways I always point to people is they're not wrong. Their job is not to make things difficult for us. It's to make sure that that the network works, that it is secure, and it is doing what it needs to be doing for everybody. And that's kind of what I have to reference is they may be annoying and they may be difficult, but there's a lot that we can learn from them.
That is right. The practices that are developed are good practices to have. And of course, one of the challenges for the broadcast station is we're not like some other industries. For instance, that today we really do not have any regulatory cybersecurity requirements. Yes, you and I may have some because we're part of a state university. Others might be part of a large corporate environment that has those policies, but we really don't have any regulatory implications. And certainly, I think if we've been keeping up with our trade publications, we should be aware that that may be changing. In the future, particularly as the FCC has at least issued a notice of proposed rulemaking regarding cybersecurity precautions, specifically regarding the EAS infrastructure. So that may be changing in that we do or will have some regulatory requirements to comply with as well.
Yeah, we had our friends here, the SBE General Counsel, on a few months ago to talk about that, and it was a great discussion. And I think one of the takeaways that I got from it is the FCC doesn't want to do this, but they've been put in the position that they're responsible for a system that is integral to broadcast, and it's only as strong as its weakest link.
Right.
And if a station's just going to put an EAS box out there on the public internet and not lock it down, well, at some point something's got to give.
That's right. And if you look, of course, at the FCC, we're broadcasters. That's all we think about. But the FCC regulates a lot of communications industries. And several of those industries they regulate, they are regulations, cybersecurity related. And it's like, okay, it's finally catching up with the broadcast world. And, we can, of course, gosh, we could spend hours debating what the FCC might do. In general, my personal opinion is there's not really anything bad about what they've proposed. I do have some concerns about how you might comply with some of it, particularly the reporting. But in terms of the practices that I've seen suggested, that is all common, what I call good cybersecurity practices.
Unintended consequences because of a law? That never happens. Imagine that. So we just have a few minutes left here, but one thing I did want to ask you, and I submitted this question to you before because this question still comes up from time to time, and I see this on mailing lists, and I see this on people's computers that are they're running a 10-year-old computer or whatever. Do we need antivirus in 2023? An antivirus program?
Well, I think, an antivirus program, that's a pretty broad term.
Okay, let me give
And
you an example. Something like McAfee or one of these third-party AVG
yeah,
kind of thing. How relevant are those in a modern era?
well, I think they have their purpose, and I'll use Windows Defender as an example. That comes with Windows. I think for the most part, that is certainly a a very adequate antivirus program for a desktop computer. If we really want to look at uh, enterprise level um, antivirus, you really need to go one step deeper into what I'll call some higher end, i.e., more expensive protection that utilize deep inspection techniques to actually look at content rather than um, header information, so to speak, an IP package. You need to be looking deeper at the content.
Yeah, those are absolutely fascinating. You get up to those enterprise ones like the Palo Altos and things like that. They
Yeah,
deployed those at our university, and what was fascinating is when they deployed that firewall, there was about a month where nothing worked right. And I
right.
don't mean to scare people, but of course, there's a learning curve when it comes to those kinds of things when they deploy them. And they've since gotten better. This was about 4 or 5 years ago now that they put this in. But that's exactly what it does because it was thinking things like GoToMeeting were malicious behavior, and that's what it was programmed to do. And those things will help. So if it sees like something like a ransomware that's trying to wreak havoc on the network, it'll shut it down.
Right. It's doing again that what is referred to as deep packet inspection. It's looking at the contents that is being passed through, and particularly looking. Firewalls are generally based upon signature analysis. In other words, patterns. Looking certainly for an executable, file, but take, for instance, receiving a PDF that has an embedded executable within that document. And that's one way that ransomware can spread. You need a firewall that is capable of detecting that. And often um, the add-on products, whatever may be your favorite, are not going to be at that level.
Well, Wayne, I certainly appreciate your time. This has been super helpful to talk about this kind of stuff, and particularly with as timely as it is, with stations still kind of grappling with the fallout of our most recent attacks. This is always a relevant topic because, unfortunately, this is going to happen to somebody at some point, and another time.
Very good. Well, thanks for the time to share some thoughts about a passionate subject.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Wayne. We'll turn things over to Chris, who will wrap things up, but just wanted to say thank you again for watching this afternoon.
Thanks, Kevin. This has been the SBE WEBxtra, the SBE chapter of the web. We present this monthly, and we hope you'll join us each time. We'll post the replay on our YouTube channel, usually within a day. If you hold SBE certification, viewing the SBE WEBxtra qualifies you for 1/2 point in Category G, that's attendance. It's just like attending a local chapter meeting. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest for the SBE WEBxtra, send it to me at webextra@sbe.org. And that does it for this installment of the SBE WEBxtra from the Society of Broadcast Engineers, the Association for Broadcast and Multimedia Technology Professionals. Thanks again to our guest, Wayne Pacina, and on behalf of Kevin Trueblood, we'll see you next month.